Hello and welcome back to Litcast. In this episode, we're going to be exploring Act 2 of An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley in lots more detail. So, let's get into it. All right, we left the end of Act 1 and Sheila was telling Gerald that the inspector knows everything, so try not to outsmart him. We then jump into Act 2. Act 2 begins with Gerald's confession. So the inspector begins to question Gerald. And Gerald asks the inspector to excuse Sheila from hearing what is about to be said, so you know where this is going. But Sheila insists on staying. Remember I said that as soon as she's had that confession, she starts to change and mature and develop. Well, here we see some of that strength. So Sheila insists on staying because she, in part, to hear what is said by her soon-to-be husband, but also then so she doesn't feel that sole burden of guilt. Right now she feels solely responsible for Eva Smith's death. She wants to hear about this full chain of events. So Mrs. Burling enters with an air of self-importance. So Sheila tries then, without success, to persuade her mother not to alienate the inspector, not to get his back up, basically. She doesn't want him to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl. Mr. Burling asks the inspector to interview Eric immediately so that he can go to bed. And again, depending on performance, sometimes you see that Eric at this point is noticeably drunk, kind of stumbling or slurring or exaggerated gestures. So they feel like, to save face in front of a police inspector, let's just get him out of the way. But the inspector refuses, saying that he must wait his turn. So that creates some tension there, doesn't it? Because, you know, there's no guarantee that every single member of the family is involved, and yet the inspector said he needs to wait his turn, which means that at some point he will have to go through the interrogation. Both Mr. and Mrs. Burling are shocked when the inspector explains that Eva changed her name to Daisy Renton. Then the interrogation of Gerald begins. He turns to Gerald and he asks, "When did you first get to know her?" And this perfect, shining knight in armour and prince that Gerald has been to them, and the idea of Sheila marrying so well and their businesses merging and all these lovely things are about to come crashing down around them, because Gerald is about to shatter that with admissions of what he did last summer. So Priestley increases the sense of mystery here surrounding the inspector's identity. And Sheila is the one that kind of helps to make that happen. She stares at him wonderingly. She says things like, "I don't understand about you." And Mr. Burling's reaction to the inspector again highlights how obstinate the older Burlings are. Mrs. Burling. Although Mr. Burling does that too. Because she ignores Sheila's advice and she deals with the inspector as a social inferior. So she's trying to outclass him and it doesn't work. And both of them try to use their status to reduce him or to make him inferior. And again, it doesn't work like perhaps it usually does, because otherwise why would they default to that? Maybe this is something they do all the time. We don't know. Then we've got the interrogation of Gerald. So Gerald says that he met Daisy Renton sometime in March last year. And he explains that basically he saved her from the clutches of Alderman Meggerty, who is just a bit of a gross old man. He then... So Alderman Meggerty is a bit of a gross old man, but Gerald's not much better, because he saves her and then basically sets Daisy Renton up as his mistress. So that then explains that summer where Sheila says Gerald never came near her. Gerald leaves the Burlings' house then, once he's admitted this, to recover from the shock of Daisy's death. And here we see a few things worth noting. So Alderman Meggerty's predatory attitude towards women. Again, we mentioned that an alderman is kind of this senior figure, political figure, so in kind of a town council situation. So he's a good social standing and it's a public office, but there's no guarantee of good character. And this mirrors Burling and raises that idea, this is what Priestley wants to raise, the fact that you can be in public office but not necessarily be a good person. And Priestley also suggests here that Sheila has the capacity to learn from what's happened. So already there's that change. She says to Gerald, you and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner here. So there's already that maturing, there's already that self-realization there. And she arguably goes through one of the most profound changes in the play. So Gerald is outside or in another room trying to recover from the shock of Daisy's death. Now, it is worth mentioning here that, and I think we mentioned this in the Gerald episode, that people are sometimes sympathetic of Gerald because he helped her. Whereas the others, there's no way you could say that they helped her. The tricky thing is that to what extent does he help her, and is there an expectation from him, whether it's said or not, that she then has to repay him somehow, because she is a vulnerable woman of lower class, he is a higher class wealthy male. He would be able to put pressure on her and would be able to kind of develop that dependency quite easily. So he's a complex character, and I think people sometimes look at him in a sympathetic way, but he does use her, and the length of time that he uses her for, to his own end, and then the fact that he's able to sort of just get rid of her, all of that again doesn't sort of make him look too good. So Gerald disappears, and then the inspector turns to Mrs. Burling. Mrs. Burling asks to see the photograph. She then gets very irritated by the fact that the inspector asks her several quite direct questions, which of course is his job, but she doesn't like that. Sheila here then begins to see the inspector as this moral force, and she realises that the family has at this point an opportunity to be educated about their responsibilities and to change the way that they think. The inspector reveals that Mrs. Burling was the last member of the family to see Eva Smith alive. But remember, Eric is still waiting his turn. Eva Smith, pregnant and desperate, had turned to a woman's charity in Bromley. This woman's charity was headed up by Mrs. Burling. It was quite common for upper-class women to do that sort of charity work because it looks good. It looks like you're being a good person, right? So she turned up at this charity for assistance, and Mrs. Burling defended her decision to reject the girl's appeal for help. So Mrs. Burling is the one who rejected the appeal by Eva Smith. Eric is heard leaving the house early on in this particular section, so the interrogation of Mrs. Burling, and this section ends with his return. So Priestley draws attention here to the idea of duty and responsibility through the repetition of all the associated words. So we've got words like duty and responsibility popping up a lot, but there's differences. So when Mr. and Mrs. Burling say it, they often use it in a way where it means a different thing to some of the other characters, and that really sort of highlights their different priorities. Priestley also presents Mr. and Mrs. Burling in unity throughout this section. They support each other's decisions, and that potentially looks at how easily unfair behaviour can be perpetuated if people are standing up for each other out of a sense of blind loyalty, rather than looking at the situation in a little bit more of an analytical way. So this particular section, this particular act, ends with Mrs. Burling. She's frustrated by the inspector's questioning, but the inspector is not letting up, and he pushes for her to explain, well, if you're not guilty for what happened to Eva Smith and the fact that you pushed her away, then who is responsible? And Mrs. Burling quite quickly says the fact that Eva is pregnant, she says that it's the father's responsibility. So there's a couple of reasons why she turns her away. One of the reasons is that she turns up and calls herself Mrs. Burling. So the fact that Eva comes in and calls herself Mrs. Burling gets really offended by that. Obviously, Eva Smith didn't know that Mrs. Burling was the head of that charity. But then you start to question where she got that name from. Why did she decide to call herself Mrs. Burling? Then she says that the story didn't stand up that Eva Smith said. So her story was, she says, that he'd said something one night when he was drunk, and basically that the father was giving her stolen money. And there'd already been a story that Eva Smith had shared about her being a married woman who'd been deserted by her husband, and Mrs. Burling hadn't bought that. So then she tried to tell her the truth, and again she'd not bought that either. So Mrs. Burling said that she was perfectly justified in advising the committee not to allow her claim for assistance. Then, in a quite straightforward way, the inspector says, who is to blame then? And Mrs. Burling says first the girl herself, and then says that, again through sort of further pushing by the inspector, that actually the father would be entirely responsible, because the girl wouldn't have come to us and wouldn't have been refused assistance if it hadn't have been for him. And he ought to be dealt with very severely. And at that point, Sheila, with sudden alarm, says, stop, because Sheila has suddenly worked out that a girl who's turned up at this charity calling herself Mrs. Burling and saying that she's pregnant and that she was getting money from the father of the baby, and the money was coming from the place where the father's dad worked, and that perhaps that person has someone who works in industry where that money might be possible to get hold of, and there's one other person to be interrogated in the family. Sheila puts it all together, and at this point lots of the audience are starting to put it together. But Mrs. Burling doesn't stop. She digs herself into a hole. She says that the father should be punished. She says that there should be some sort of public outcry. She says there should be some sort of public confession of responsibility, and that the inspector should go and find the father of this child and talk to him, because you know what, it's all entirely his responsibility. And then Eric comes home. And that is the end of Act 2. So join us in our next episode, where we'll go through Act 3 in a bit more detail, and then you'll have your full detailed coverage of the play. Thank you so much for tuning in with us, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for listening to Litcast, the podcast for GCSE and A-level revision. The music that you hear in this episode is called Galaxy and was written by Ixon, and you can find the rest of his music on SoundCloud. You can also find us on other social media channels, including YouTube, where you'll also find our Litcast live episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you again.